But I never do it. Yeah, but I was just.
Now we're just going to pick up from where we left off last time, but I do just kind of want to emphasize the situation where the Russians find themselves when they invade Afghanistan. They attempt to spread communism, and it fails. They lose to a bunch of Afghan guerrillas, and that just inspires other resistance movements throughout other nations that they have controlled for years and years, namely in Eastern Europe. Now, I was telling you guys yesterday, this is really going to be the start where we start seeing some cracks. The Soviet Union is starting to wobble because they just don't have the economy to truly try to be a world power. They've been really just kind of sucking dry resources of other satellite states, and now they're in a situation where they're starting to fall apart. Now we just need to push them over. What we're going to see as really the last step to pushing them over is going to be this big shift in Cold War policy. Now, I say it's a big shift, but really what happens is we're going to have a new president from the 1980 presidential election. Now, remember, going into that election, President Carter has had a lot of things not go his way. A weak economy, the Iranian hostage crisis, he can't get him out. He's got all sorts of issues, but he runs for re-election in 1980. And he's going up against someone who has been really gaining in political momentum for the past several years. In fact, he's not even a long-time politician. In fact, his first career, he was an actor. Ronald Reagan is going to run for the presidency in 1980. And Ronald Reagan, and this again, his first career, he was an actor and he was called the king of B movies. So I'll ask you guys, you know those movies that like, you can just tell it's like low budget? Like the special effects are like all kind of off and you know what I mean. He did over 100 of those movies. Now he's the president. But he gets elected because of what he's saying really about the Soviet Union, about the Cold War itself. Where what he says is the Soviet Union and the spread of communism is the biggest problem the world has ever seen. We have to end this threat. And the way we're going to do it is, we are going to do it by promoting American values. Ronald Reagan was a staunch conservative, and he promoted individual freedom and individual liberty and American patriotism. And he had some great kind of one-liners about the federal government, where he said the scariest thing in the world you can hear someone say is, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. He always said, it's like, don't trust that. He said, don't believe in the federal government, believe in yourself. What Ronald Reagan would often say is, the federal government's not the solution, the federal government's the problem. He wants to get the government out of people's way, get them off their backs. And by doing this, he says, I'm going to unleash the potential of the American people. He drastically cuts taxes, enormous tax cuts. These tax cuts lead to the most robust economy in decades. They rivaled the 1920s. And he said, I'm going to get the government out of the way. Let the American people realize the fruits of their labor. Get the government out of the way and let them keep more of the money they make. Let's see what happens. By drastically cutting taxes and encouraging investment, we have this massive boom in our economy. It takes it to levels we hadn't seen in years. And I want to ask you guys, we talked about it yesterday, how's the Russian economy? It's not going well. So what Reagan says is, we're going to use economic strength to push the Soviet Union over. Now in 1980, when he runs for the presidency, it's pretty much known he's going to win. All the polls are saying that Jimmy Carter couldn't compete with him. In 1980, Reagan's going to win in a landslide. But 4 years later, when he's running for re-election, he wins by even more. He won every state except for 2. He is going to be one of the most popular presidents in modern American history. Now, when he's in office, or even when he's campaigning, he has kind of a quirk about him that makes him a really interesting candidate. What Reagan's always going to say is, we might have a nuclear exchange. It could happen. And if they launch, I will launch back. And I have no problem with that. He kind of comes off, well, even the Russian says, like, this guy's a cowboy. This guy's a lunatic. He might launch. And it's kind of hard to say exactly, because maybe he was. Maybe he was very interested in doing that. But probably, he's just playing a poker game. He's just using aggression to get what he wants. He convinces the Russians that he might launch. And the Russians, they openly talk about this. Gorbachev has it written down where he said, I was constantly nervous that Reagan would launch first. Because he never gave me an inkling that he was weak. He was always strong. Reagan's going to use this to his advantage. As the Soviet Union is starting to wobble, what Reagan says is, the worst thing you can do is coddle the Soviet Union. The worst thing you can do is be nice to them. We need to end them. And the way we end the Soviet Union is to put pressure on them. Make them make choices, especially in regards to economics. We need to make them spend. So I will ask you guys, how do we make the Soviet Union spend money? Brody, what do you think?
Destroying property.
Say again, I'm sorry?
Destroying property.
Destroying property. We could always use the atomic bomb. Absolutely, always an option. No, you're sure. How do we make the government spend? What do you think?
Like, kind of just like on like the images, like show yourself like getting more advanced and making it feel like they're like behind, so they have to put more resources and money to like keeping up with the US.
You are absolutely right. I'm so glad you said that. Let's make them keep up. What Reagan's going to do is just spend on defense and on what he calls the nuclear triad. He says, I'm going to build up the military even more. I'm going to spend and spend and spend and invest in new technologies, and I'm going to even increase the number of nuclear weapons we have. Let's make the Russians try to compete against us. Because if we're building more and more nuclear weapons, what do the Russians have to do? Build more. Make them spend. So we're going to probably, and you'll never exactly know, but we're going to probably build about 50% more nuclear weapons. Now, this also kind of plays into Reagan's campaigning, where he said, yeah, I'll launch if needs be. Now he's building all these nuclear weapons, and the Russians are thinking, oh my gosh, this cowboy's going to do it. He's a lunatic. He might launch. So we better build as well. They build more nuclear weapons. And Reagan simply says, not a problem. I'll just invest in a way to be certain that if there's a nuclear exchange, we'll come out on top. What Reagan says is, we're going to increase military spending in really 2 big facets. The first one, he says, we're going to invest tons of money in some new technologies that Reagan calls the nuclear triad. Now, his nuclear triad is designed to be certain that the Soviet Union could never knock out all of our nuclear capability. What Reagan creates is a 3-legged ability to deliver nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union should there be an exchange. Now, I want to just kind of explain each one, so let me do it like this. This leg right here is the ability to drop nuclear weapons via airplane. Now, this is what's called the B-52 Stratofortress, massive airplane. It's enormous. It can fly about 4 or 5 hours without being refueled, and then it can refuel in midair. It's awesome. But it's not anywhere close to this new technology we have. Do you guys know what this is? Oh, God. This is the stealth bomber. The stealth bomber is incredible. The stealth bomber is invisible to radar. The way that it's built and the way that it's put together, when radar waves hit it, it doesn't bounce back to the radar tower. It just goes off somewhere else into the ether. But also, there's a special kind of paint that's put on this that you'll never be able to know about that absorbs radar waves. So when this thing is flying over the top of you, you can't see it on radar. This thing just shows up. It's awesome. Each one of these costs about $1 billion. We're going to build about 20 of them. It's incredible. Oh, it gets even better. This can deliver, if it's at full capacity, probably about 20 to 25 nuclear warheads. It's an absolute devastating weapon, should you need it. This is Plan A. Plan B is our land-based nuclear missiles. Now, this is an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. This is what we have about 20 miles away. Now, maybe if the Soviets launch first, they can hit the land-based ICBMs. They can't get all the airplanes. Now, if they're lucky, we'll just pretend that somehow they get all the land-based weapons and they knock out the Air Force. We still have option C. Nuclear submarines. These submarines are still roaming the oceans now. They can be anywhere under the water and launch nuclear missiles. Now, I don't know if I'm going to scare you or make you feel better, so I'm going to go ahead and just tell you anyway. The way that these things work is every probably about month or so, they come to the surface to get a radio message. If they get that message that says don't launch, then they submerge and go back under for about a month. If they are going to go ahead and come to the surface and that message doesn't come through, they launch because they assume that we've been hit by a nuclear missile. So if you can get all the land-based missiles, if somehow you can get all the Air Force, the submarines will hit you next. We will win if there's a nuclear exchange. This is what Reagan guarantees. Now, there's another part to this. And this part is either brilliant or crazy. I'm still not quite sure what else. The second thing that Reagan emphasizes is we're going to create a missile defense system. We're going to put laser beams in space. Did you guys hear that? We're going to put laser beams in space. This is what Reagan wants to do. When he becomes president, he sits down. This is honestly one of the first days he's in office. Sits down with his military advisors and says, so what happens if there is a nuclear exchange? What happens if the Russians launch first? And these very high-ranking generals just say, well, then we launch back and we blow up the world. It's mutual assured destruction. And Reagan just tells them, that's not good enough. I want something in place so if they launch, we can knock out their missiles before they get here. If they launch ICBMs up into the stratosphere and they start coming down on us, I want laser beams in space to shoot down these rockets. Does anyone else think that's a little weird? That kind of technology didn't exist. It still doesn't exist. So you have these generals saying, so let me get this straight. You want Star Wars? And Reagan just said, ooh, I like that name. Let's call this the Star Wars program. Get on it. So you have these generals leaving this meeting going, I think that guy might be losing his mind. I think he's crazy. But let's see what we can do. So we have all these scientists on this idea. They start putting together some very simple kind of plans. And Reagan tells the Russians about it. He tells Mikhail Gorbachev, yeah, we're working on this. And if we get it before you do, we now have what he called a steel dome over us. You can launch if you want, but our Star Wars program will just knock out your missiles. And then we'll launch, and you'll be annihilated. We almost have it figured out. Now let me ask you guys, why on